Well, it's time for a book review, and this is a kind of a follow-up book review, and I'm going to give kind of a quick summary of the original book, and then a follow-up about the new edition. But those of you who've never heard of Why Johnny Can't Come Home, at the end screen, I'm going to link to my original review of the original edition. So this is the 2000 edition of Why Johnny Can't Come Home by Noreen Gosch. And Noreen Gosch's son, Johnny Gosch, pictured on the cover here, was abducted on his paper route in 1982, just over 42 years ago. She wrote this book in the year 2000 with all the information up to that point about the case. Fascinating book. Lots of information in this because she goes way beyond the scope of just her son's kidnapping and a lot of kind of this spider web of other connections related to child prostitution and just corruption in general. Because if you're familiar with the Johnny Gosch story, you know that she ran into a lot of friction from law enforcement and especially the FBI, the local law enforcement. And this, of course, all took place in Des Moines, Iowa. And is it Des Moines or Des Moines? In Iowa, which is not far from Omaha, Nebraska. So this does have a little bit of overlap with the Franklin scandal. So the new book, the updated version, now I have not gone through this page by page. I've mainly read all of the new information in section 3. And that's the introduction to all of this is the new material. And as far as I can tell, most of the rest of the book is pretty much the same. Still has a whole chapter devoted to John Gosch Sr., Johnny's dad, who engaged in, to put it very politely, some very questionable behavior before and after the abduction. As far as I can tell, all of that information is there. Still has a lot of the same pictures and things like that. One of the curious things that happened involving, and I promise you I'm not just wasting your time, I'm trying to find the page here of this picture here. This is John Gosch Sr. with a double of Noreen Gosch, who actually went and visited Paul Bonacci in prison, and as well as John DeCamp, sorry, brain cramp, as well as a few other people who, and Noreen ran her down and figured out she was a private investigator posing as her. And there's a picture of her actually with her husband. So there's a lot of weird stuff like that. And I'll throw out my theory at the end of this video as to why that happened, because that's a very curious thing to do. And for them to actually wind up getting photographed together, evidently they actually did some publicity appearances together, which is really odd. So anyway, I'm getting off track. As for the new information is there's a lot of good stuff in here. So one of the best things about this is the original book had become something of a unicorn. I think when I bought my original copy, I think I paid probably $70, $80 for this. Well worth it, in my opinion. Anything to support Noreen Gosch. You can actually find this on her website. You can order a signed copy, and I'll try to remember to put a link to that in the video description, because anything you can do to support her and not the reptilians over at Amazon is always a good thing. But one of the things she talks about, there are rumors that Johnny Gosch might be Jeff Gannon, and he was a reporter for an online news, online website or online newspaper called Talon News back during the George W. Bush administration. And it was really odd that he was a former male prostitute that now had White House press credentials. So there's a lot of weird stuff about that. And she covers that in here and talks about how she does not think he is Johnny Gosch grown up or anything like that. Lots of kind of where are they now information in here about, of course, Ted Gunderson. She mentions him. He has since passed on. John DeCamp has died since the original book was published. And a lot of good follow-up on that. And also, she implicates let's see, where is the apologize, I got a bunch of stuff dog-eared in here. John David Norman. And John David Norman, she implicates him as possibly being one of the ringleaders in some of this. And those of you familiar with the podcast, The Clown and the Candyman, will probably remember that name. There's just a lot of good follow-up information. So if you're curious about the case, highly recommend it. Get it if for no other reason than this last part. But the best part is it's made the book accessible because, again, the original copy was going for a small mint. So I think I paid like $29 for this. And then I saw I could get it signed off her website. So I might go ahead and order another copy signed just because. So anyway, one of the things I wanted to talk about in here is she mentions Larry King. And this part I found really interesting is she mentions Larry King, and Larry King, those of you familiar with the Franklin scandal, and I'll link that at the end of this as well. Larry King was the president, I think the president of the Franklin Credit Union in Omaha, Nebraska. And he was the one when that all imploded in a big financial scandal in 1989 or so. It also came out that he was running a male prostitution ring or a child prostitution ring out of the credit union. And he basically got a slap on the wrist. He never really saw justice for a lot of the stuff he was involved in, and that he was documented to be involved in. So she mentions Larry King in this. And what she mentions about this is really interesting. That she claims that a group of somebody that was helping investigate a lot of child sexual crimes and things like that was on some forum online in like the dark web or something. And Larry King was in this forum or someplace, I forget her wording exactly, but that he was selling pictures of Johnny Gosch from his abduction. In the pictures that allegedly that he had commissioned after Johnny was abducted. So she launched an effort to try to do some kind of sting operation on him with that. But he claimed before they went after him, he claimed he had something like 3,000 pictures of Johnny Gosch. Now, one of the things that this is where I think I want to wrap it up with this about two things. A couple of you have mentioned the interview with John Gosch Sr. on the podcast, the Faded Out podcast. And I listened to that the other day, and I find it interesting that there's an effort in some of those circles to say Johnny Gosch was most likely abducted, and when his mom started making a big stink of it, trying to chase him down, that he was most likely killed off and died probably not long after or was killed not too long after the original abduction. I disagree on the grounds that if he was in fact abducted by a major pedophile ring like is implicated in this and the Franklin scandal, his value as a sexual commodity, for lack of a better way to put it, would actually go up in that instance. And he would actually become something like imagine, this is a horrible analogy, but it's like if all the baseball cards of a specific player somehow get burned up in a fire, the last remaining one is going to become really valuable. And the same thing goes there. If now that you've got this kid that that is notorious for being involved in this abduction, his value to these sadistic offenders goes up exponentially. And I know to some of you that may sound kind of far-fetched, but when you look into the way some of those rings operate, and when you look into how some of those sadists behave and how they really thrive off of the anguish of the family, you start to see how that can become a thing. Now, as far as the John Gosch interview, John Gosch Sr., obviously I don't know the guy. I mean, I was a little put off by the interviewer asking him some pointed questions about a couple of things, and he would answer with a simple, no, that didn't happen, or yes or no, or whatever. But it was very, oh, okay, all right, I'll take you at face value and go on. And that's not really reporting, that's just repeating. To really engage in a journalistic effort, you really have to weigh out both sides. And I would love for Faded Out to get Noreen Gosch on and ask her some of the things and that they were talking to John Gosch Sr. about. But they seem to want to kind of put the whole thing to bed and say he was most likely abducted by a pedophile ring and then killed off pretty soon after. And there's a little bit of shade thrown on Noreen Gosch by some of the people pushing that stuff by basically saying she just wants to keep this going. She wants to just keep this alive. And of course, I mean, why wouldn't you? If it was my kid, I would definitely want to keep that going, and I would definitely want to explore all avenues to find out what happened to my child. Until I found a body, I would assume my child is out being exploited and needs my help. So the only people that benefit from putting a lid on that and saying Johnny Gosch is most likely dead are the perpetrators, because the sooner people stop looking for this guy and stop flipping over rocks trying to figure this out, the sooner those people can go about their business without any worries of retribution. So that bothers me a little bit, that there's an effort to put a lid on that, because there's absolutely no harm that can come from keeping that investigation going and keep on looking into the people involved in that case. Now, one other thing, and I really will end after this, is Noreen also mentions in both the original as well as the follow-up here, that she has actually met with her son, that he actually came to her in secret along with a friend of his who never spoke during the encounter and all that in 1997. And in the new book, she talks about how 2020, a reporter of 2020 approached her and was going to do a very extended special feature for 2020 on what all was going on with the case, and even was going to go out to, allegedly at that point, he was hiding out in an Indian reservation in the late 90s, like 97, 98, 99. And even went so far as to track him down at this specific reservation, went to go visit it. There's all kinds of weird intrigue with 2020. There's a whole section on that. And it looks like one of the tactics that's used a lot, and this was done with Conspiracy of Silence and some other similar documentaries, like I think there was one recently called something about the Open Secret or something that was about some of the Bryan Singer stuff that was going on back in the early 2012, 2013, somewhere in there, where some of these producers will come in and make a documentary about a subject, and it gives the victims hope that they're finally going to have their case heard in at least the court of public opinion. And what's really happening is they're vacuuming up all of this evidence, collecting all this information, and they have people sign away exclusive rights to the story to, say, 2020 or whatever, insert your news agency or producer here. And once they get all that information, they can just sit on it, because they're not legally bound to make the project. Or they could make it and do a horrible job of releasing it so it never really gets eyes on it like it should. And there's been a few documentaries like that where there was a lot of effort put into interviewing victims, and then it all just got canned at the end. And what that does is it winds up taking that information and putting it behind a firewall where the public's never going to see it. And that happened with a lot of the UFO phenomenon in the late 90s with NIDS, where top investigators were hired, but they didn't pay attention to the fine print. And after they submitted all this evidence, that evidence got taken away by Robert Bigelow and NIDS, and they were now bound by contract to not speak about what they had just discovered. So that kind of tactic can be used by people with very deep pockets to produce a video or produce a documentary or a show, but then never go all the way through with it. And she talks a little bit about that in here. She doesn't exactly come to that same conclusion of what I'm saying, but something kind of close to it. But I would highly recommend this. Again, those of you that recommended the John Gosch interview, I was a little frustrated with that because it did feel like he gave a very weak defense of only a couple of points that were brought up, and the faded out people, the girl Sarah that was asking the questions, just kind of moved along and took everything at face value. And I think that in something as charged as this case, you really have to be willing to dig and ask uncomfortable questions. So anyway, I'll leave it at that, but definitely an excellent follow-up. I highly recommend it. And if nothing else, this book is accessible, financially accessible again, and that is definitely a good thing. So I will stop there.